While Bitcoin has a direct impact on the world's forms of money, there are many indirect impacts when it comes to culture, when it comes to people's morality, when it comes to the decisions people make. Political currency is a monetary network of despair, debasement, fraud, and eventual destruction. Political currency, fiat money, harvests the future's productivity for the present day's consumption, and so inevitably leads to ruin and destruction. It just depends on your question of timeline. Bitcoin preserves monetary energy into the future. Bitcoin is inherently a more optimistic monetary network, and political currency is inherently a much more pessimistic currency network. Unfortunately, there are many individuals that become depressed, nihilistic, and in some very sad instances, decide to take their own life. Many individuals, unfortunately, decide to take their own life when they believe that they don't have anything to live for. Of course, there are many reasons why people become so depressed, isolated, or alone that they feel like that this is their only escape route. There are a wide variety of reasons people become this depressed and isolate themselves from the rest of the world, society, culture, and their families. However, a society that incentivizes isolation, that incentivizes despair, and doesn't have a reason to build for an optimistic future does aid in this negative feedback loop that many people find themselves in. A 2023 analysis found that people with financial stress are 74% more likely to commit suicide, and there is an 87% increase in probability for those that are unemployed. This is a dramatic correlation. Is fiat money or financial problems the only reason why people commit suicide? No, of course. But financial problems are a major contributing factor to why people commit suicide, and a major contributing factor to why there are financial problems is because of political currency. And so absolving the destruction of political currency and replacing it with something that's less nihilistic and destructive for the world won't necessarily get rid of all of these second-order impacts, but it will reduce the probability that these kinds of things become as entrenched in society as they are today. For context of the magnitude of this problem, being a veteran increases your risk of suicide by 58%, a number significantly lower than the numbers associated with financial stress and of unemployment. This is a very nuanced subject, in particular with mental health and of depression and suicide. However, it is clear that financial stress is undeniable in its role of general pessimism on the future. And likewise, it is undeniable that having a political currency that violates the law of sowing and reaping, that violates the truth, the biblical truth of honest weight and measures, and a system that does not value human time, but instead values fraud and accounting manipulation for the enrichment of oneself at the expense of another, it is clear that that is a contributing factor in fiat currency. We've also seen clearly throughout history, including recent modern history, that a destabilized society is a major contributing factor as to why people decide to take their own life. Two infamous examples are of Japan post-World War II and Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, when the Soviet Empire was collapsing. Japan had a tremendous amount of suicide in the 1950s, amounts quite literally double the current rate today. Post-World War II, after America and the Soviets caused Japan to surrender, there was a tremendous amount of suicide in the years and decade or 2 decades following World War II. And likewise, the Soviets, or now Russians, had a very large amount of suicide in the 1990s. Again, an amount roughly double the current rate of suicide. Now, globally, suicide is trending down, and it has been for decades, and this is a good thing. And this is in large part because the world societies as a whole are becoming more stabilized. As the big outliers of the Soviet Union and Japan have a dramatic decline in the number of suicides in their very large respective countries, the global average for suicide has been declining over time, and this is wonderful news. However, if the financial system were to increase in its instability, which is the current trend we're on, then one should expect that that instability eventually leads to societal weakness, and that societal weakness could eventually lead to a dramatic increase, potentially a doubling in the rate of suicide. For example, in contrast, in the United States, suicide is trending upwards, despite the fact that post-World War II and post-1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union, America has had a booming economy where prices for everything have gone up and technology has made information and living more prosperous for more people for cheaper cost in terms of number of hours worked. Even though that's what's happened, suicide rates are still trending up. Even though technology has made life better for Americans, and even though America was the dominant victor, both in comparison to Japan and the Soviet Union, the reality is that the rate of fiat debasement is accelerating beyond the rate at which technology is producing new productivity for people. And so therefore, people feel like they are being more and more constricted in the spending power they have, in having free time, and being able to use that time freely to spend with loved ones. And many of these underlying same causes as to why people are foregoing or completely ignoring the possibility of having a family, the same reason why people aren't wanting to have children, I would suggest are similar reasons as to why people are becoming generally depressed and nihilistic on the future. There are many reasons contributing to this factor. However, it is impossible to ignore the monetary nihilism from the equation of collective nihilism. People who are younger and lower income are especially prone to this risk of mental health issues, depression, and of taking own lives. Poor demographics and decaying financial opportunities will continue to contribute to this concerning trend. If America in its present moment is still having an increase in the rates of suicide, what could possibly happen if we had even larger economic downturns, even if we had higher rates of inflation, more monetary debasement, or God forbid, some sort of war or major global catastrophe? This is a major, major problem, in particular for those that are low and middle income folks, in particular for those in their late teens and early 20s. And so inherently, the lower income they are and the longer their time horizon is, then the less optimistic they can be about the future economy and the future money, because the longer your time horizon, the higher the probability political currency dies, and the lower your income, the lower you rank in the Cantillon effect, the farther away you are from the money printer. In recent years, there have been many horrifying headlines of various kinds of financial gamblers, assisted suicide individuals, and all kinds of other forms of collective mistreatment, and this is a very sad and horrifying trend. One example is that of a 20-year-old Robinhood investor, or frankly gambler, who died by suicide after seeing a negative $730,000 balance on his account. And perhaps the most horrifying thing of all was that that account balance was a glitch, but it still magnifies the reality. America's young people feel like that they have less and less of a future in productivity, and therefore they need to spend more and more of their time gambling in regulation or management of capital. When society is not properly rewarding people for being productive, people cease to have the economic incentive to be productive. And when people cease to be productive and work, then that means that a lot of people lose a purpose. They lose a hope of contributing to the world, contributing to society, and they lose the opportunity to provide for themselves and their families in the future. And so this is a very unfortunate thing to see, that young people feel like they need to gamble or speculate to get ahead, that they need to increase their risk. And unfortunately, this is one of the reasons why many people look at Bitcoin holders, investors, and long-term financial engineers and think that they are a part of the same crowd. People assume that Bitcoin holders are short-term speculators or gamblers, when in reality it couldn't be farther from the truth. Also, we have seen all kinds of other horrifying nihilistic and depressing advancements and headlines in the world, from various kinds of suicide pods to medically assisted dying techniques, to some people saying that life has no purpose and that humans are effectively a cancer on the planet, and the most ethical thing we can do is to end the suffering and to end ourselves. This is a very horrifying reality. To quantify this, currently there are approximately 700,000 people that commit suicide every single year. And if financial stress is quite literally a contributing factor on a percentage basis larger than being a veteran of a war, then I think it is safe to say that this could have a material impact on the number of suicides in the future by having a more ethical and sound monetary system. If financial stress is a tipping point responsible for 20% of the 700,000 deaths, and an ethical monetary system where people have optimism reduces those deaths by 50%, that is potentially 70,000 lives annually that are spared because these people, in part because of a more optimistic financial future, but also, hopefully, that more optimistic financial future and that increased sense of responsibility and sovereignty encourages people to find new networks of people and friends and build the things that are lasting paths towards health and healing, like communities, like church integration, like starting a family, like all those other things. Many of these financial related deaths and suicides, unfortunately, are from the result of poor financial, debt, or addiction reasons. However, sound money assists in this horrifying reality. Of course, some people commit suicide not because they feel the general future of the economy is bleak, but because they have been addicted to some drug or substance that has depleted their savings and now added a financial stress on top of another stress. Of course, some people make poor financial decisions, get in tremendous amounts of debt. Of course, those things aren't necessarily directly correlated with the political currency fiat monetary system. However, I would argue even for these kinds of financial related stress-induced depressions or suicides, I would even argue in those instances, much of the gambling, alcoholism, drug addictions, and all these other things are as a result of a monetary system that is industrialized and globalized fraud at a global level. I would argue even just a percentage of these 700,000 deaths could be a very significant multi tens of thousands of people every single year that we're helping prevent these kinds of events. Even with this 10% rate of reduction, that is a total of 7 million lives saved over the coming century. That's 7 million people. That's a tremendous number of human beings. And of course, this is not quantifying the number of people that are living in depression or don't commit suicide, but are very, very nihilistic or depressed in their future, right? So just in the number of people that end up committing suicide on their own, even if it's not 10%, maybe it's 2%, maybe it's 20%, I don't know. But if we assume a 10% rate, that's 7 million people over the next century, which in the grand scheme of things is not very long. Additionally, political currency is guaranteed to get worse. Political currency must debase. The interest rates are exponential. The whole system will continue to unwind. That 7 million number we were looking at a moment ago is only with the current rate of suicide on an annual basis. However, like we mentioned before, suicide is unfortunately increasing in many Western nations, in particular in the United States. And so putting aside the 7 million based on the current annual rate, we have to keep in mind that Bitcoin can help reduce the probability of a major global calamity, depression, or conflict in the future. Just as we saw with Japan and the Soviet Union, suicide rates could skyrocket in the fallout from some kind of war or crisis. For example, in the United States, the suicide rate increased by about 23% during the Great Depression. War veterans also are a very large, disproportionate demographic that unfortunately end up disproportionately committing suicide. And so if we can prevent more Great Depressions over the next 100 years, if we can prevent more wars over the next 100 years, that means that we can reduce not only the current annual number of people that commit suicide every single year, but hopefully we can reduce the major kinds of society-altering stressor events that unfortunately are contributing factors in people's struggles here. If the Bitcoin monetary system can fully prevent just a mere three 5-year periods of a 30% spike in suicide, if Bitcoin can just reduce 3 5-year periods of a modest 30% spike in suicide, keep in mind that in Japan and the Soviet Union it doubled in those periods of time, that is an additional 3.15 million prevented suicides over the course of the next 100 years. In total, between Bitcoin Bitcoin reducing the amount of current suicides and also hopefully preventing the possibility of suicide-inducing global events in the future, hopefully collectively, this means Bitcoin could prevent potentially over 10 million suicides in the next century or so from a marginal decrease in the global rate. Of course, this is a very nuanced topic with many factors. However, I think it is undeniable to accept and realize that an optimistic monetary system helps install and start a feedback loop of optimism in people who otherwise might cling on to an ideology or a sickness of despair, depression, and hopelessness. Bitcoin is monetary hope, and hopefully that hope helps people have even more optimism and hope in the rest of their lives. Another illness of society that has become more and more commonplace in a world that has less and less optimism for the future is not only people ending their own lives, but people not desiring to have children. And in extreme circumstances, people even ending the lives of their own children. In some cases outside of the womb, but in most cases within the womb. Abortion thrives on the destruction of the family, an abundance of sexual expediency, and a shortage of housing for young families. If you destroy the economic future, you make people more willing to destroy their own future for themselves and also for future generations. When you have a political currency that is operating in a zero-sum mindset, people begin to view children from a zero-sum mindset and view these children as burdens, not as precious humans made in the image of God. When you survey people that have abortions, in particular, obviously women, when you survey them, there are a wide variety of reasons. Again, there's a lot of nuance and complexity in this subject. However, it is undeniable that a large number of parents, or in particular women, decide to have abortions and end the lives of their children, in particular because of economic or financial reasons. 34.5% of women cite economic and housing problems as a primary cause for their decision to end the life of their child. Many other parents say wrong timing is their reason why. And of course, when people say wrong timing, typically financial or educational reasons are heavily timed up into that. A disruption of life plans, goals, education/work, which I would argue is also something financially related. That is the third leading cause. And the fourth leading cause, of course, is that they feel like they have enough children already. The fifth leading cause is that they feel like that they are too young. And then beyond that, a partner's reluctance to be a father. Beyond that, they feel they're too old. They feel like they have health problems, that there are fetal abnormalities, and then, of course, other reasons, right? The vast majority of the reasons why women decide to have abortions is undeniably because of various kinds of economic reasons, whether that's with education, or that's with work, or that's with timing, or that's with having their plan, or that they feel like that they have too many children, that they don't have the time, or whatever, right? This is very, very unfortunate. And this is something that obviously fiat money is not the primary cause for. A love of death and of evil and of not protecting the future. This is the ultimate cause. And the reality is that fiat money does not cause people to view the world in this kind of lens, but fiat money does institutionalize and incentivize people to go down this path. Not just mothers, but also fathers as well, also men. This is not a men versus women issue. This is a sickness that has infected much of, in particular, the younger generations. This is not even to mention the fact that many kinds of abortion practices are funded by the U.S. government or by other governments to be. Now, it is true, surgical abortion is going in the right direction. Surgical abortion has been trending down since the 1990s. This is a good thing. However, it is forgetting the context that medicated abortion has been filling its place. In fact, it has even surpassed the rate of surgical abortion. New technologies have a quote-unquote rebound effect. No matter good or bad, whether the technology is good or bad, there is almost always a rebound effect. Just because one technology is becoming no longer the primary means of doing something, something else fills its place and then some. Just because we got rid of physical cameras doesn't mean that the smartphones take less pictures. In fact, they take more pictures. And unfortunately, the same thing is true here. While the number of clinically provided abortions in the United States has fallen dramatically from about 1.6 million in the 1990s all the way down to under a million as recently as the early 2020s, while it has fallen by about a third or even more than a third, the reality is that the number of U.S. abortions administered via pills has skyrocketed from basically none at the turn of the millennia all the way up to a massive, massive percentage of the total number of abortions across America. And this trend is trending higher and higher and higher. If we're going to quantify this, annually across the globe, there are about 130 million people born in any given year. There are approximately 73 million abortions that occur. This means that throughout human history, when factoring global population trends, there are roughly somewhere between 5.3 to 15 billion abortions throughout the history of humanity. What this means is that approximately 35% of the children conceived in any given year don't even make it to birth because their parents and human beings voluntarily decide that they no longer want to have that human being, or that the ending and extermination of that life is worth more than the financial, economic, personal, or whatever benefit that they view in their life. This is something that is very tragic. This is something that is very sad. Again, 130 million births a year and 73 million are abortions. This is a tremendously large amount. In fact, I would dare say an amount way larger than what most people are even aware of. Up to 40%, depending on what survey you ask, up to 40% of abortions are due to various kind of economic, housing, career, or financially related reasons. That is a tremendous number. All of these causes, all these reasons or justifications as to why people do this are exacerbated by institutionalized destruction of the monetary system. All these things are exacerbated by a culture and an economy that idolizes currency units over human lives. Political currency is a monetary system that rests and stands upon an annual rate of fraud. We harvest, aka steal, time from the poorest people in the world, the least fortunate people in the world, the people that have the weakest voice in the world, and we strengthen and we redistribute that wealth to the wealthiest people in the world, right? Working for a political currency system is to work for something that was made by fiat decree of human beings. It is a rejection of God's order. It is a rejection of truth in the world, and instead of a worshiping of a monetary god, of a central banker. And so when you have a culture, when you have a world, when you have a society that gives more preference to what mankind says over what is truth, when you have a world that idolizes and institutionalizes an annual rate of fraud, an annual rate of theft, that causes people to care more about their accolades and their currency standings than of caring about their family and caring about people in their life, right? When you have a society that values more so and has a greater emphasis on economic achievements versus interpersonal relationships and friendships and community, it should be no surprise that this is exactly the kind of world you get. The number of reported annual worldwide abortions by region is what you see on the chart here between 1921 and 2022, roughly about a century. And what you can see is that the number of abortions has completely skyrocketed from the mid-20th century onwards. Obviously, there are many factors to this, right? However, despite the world becoming more prosperous, significantly more prosperous since since post-World War II in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, all the way up to today, despite the world having more technological progress, more and more people are voluntarily choosing to end the lives of their born, or in particular, in this case, unborn children. There's a tremendous number of abortions. And of course, you can look at each individual country. You can see there's a tremendous number in India, obviously India being number one, China being number two. But of course, you have the Soviet Union that has been trending down dramatically, in large part due to their collapsing demographics of young people. And of course, you have many other countries on this list as well. But all of them have trended up so that collectively there was a humongous amount of people, and even that this is unfortunately happening to every single year. And like I say, in many other instances, we have less in common with the near future than the ancient past. If we were having this conversation in the 1940s and we were to say that, hey, the majority of abortions are in the next 80 years, not in the previous 800 years, that would sound really absurd to say. However, it has become true. And my concern is that as technology continues to progress, we will have even more abundant ways to mess or manipulate or engineer or re-engineer or distort various kinds of embryos, zygotes, or otherwise, unborn people. If you were to chart it out throughout the entirety of human history, I think this is more or less what you'd be looking like. You'd be looking at a very long and flat line over the course of multiple millennia, but then as technology gets better, people have decided to experiment or end the lives of the unborn, especially over the course of the last century. And if that continues, I think that the majority of abortions are in the future, not in the past. I think the majority of abortions are in the next 100 years, not in the previous 5,000 years. If, for example, to give a practical number to this, if there are 73 million abortions in the on any given year on average right now. And roughly that number increases by about 3% a year over the course of the next 100 years. Keep in mind that the global population increases roughly 1% over that given period of time. That means that there will be approximately 44 billion abortions over the next 100 years, which is a tremendously, insanely high number. Obviously, it's impossible to know what that future world is going to look like. However, if the annual rate of abortion is merely triple that of the rate of human population growth, we could easily be looking not only at billions, but potentially tens of billions of instances. There will be more abortions in the next century than all of human history combined up until this point. Plus a much, much larger human population. The reason why 44 billion sounds like such a tremendously high number, it sounds like something that's not even possible, is because, number one, the human population is growing, number one. Number two, because the human population is at a higher number over a longer period of time, right? Even though the world population is 8 billion people today, there have only been a few years where we've had more than 8 billion people. However, for the entirety of the upcoming century, there will be more than 8 billion people most likely. And so not only are there more people in the future, but there are more people in the future for a longer period of time in the future. And of course, like I said a moment ago, technology is accelerating, and probably as technology makes abortions or ending unborn lives even more expedient and with less perceived side effects for the parents, then of course, people probably are going to trend in that direction. Like I said, we have less in common with the near future than the past. Now, will a ethical and sound monetary system magically end all the evils and sadness and death and despair in the world? No, of course it will not. However, having an economic system that doesn't rely on fraud and deception and lies and myths truths every single year to exist, hopefully will help people see the reality of the mistruths and the state-sponsored and state-sanctioned lies that many young parents, and particularly young mothers, are being told about their unborn children. It should not be a surprise. It should be perfectly obvious as to why so many young people are being sold this lie, this mistruth that families are not worth having, these mistruths that children are burdens, not blessings, these mistruths that just because a child is not yet out of the womb means that they are just a clump of cells, right? All these things should not be a surprise when the state-sanctioned and the state-approved monetary system is on the entire basis of fraud that is misinformation, because money is information, and when the information itself is not true, it is inherently misinformation. The entire system is dependent on a growing rate of misinformation. And if you want to continue to prop up the asset prices of assets on the balance sheet of the nation, well then of course it makes sense that you prioritize and value the appreciation of assets instead of the appreciation of human beings. And so of course, having a monetary system that is not misinformation, that is based on truth, that does value human life more than just digits on a screen, of course, it should be inevitable that people regain more common sense, or at least that people aren't spreading these kinds of mistruths on state-sponsored propaganda machines. If instead of the global abortion rate growing at roughly 3% over the coming century, if instead we shrunk that by 3% annually, that would result in roughly 21 billion fewer abortions over the coming century. Again, that would be still a tremendously large number. Even if we took the current number of 73 million a year and we only reduced that number by 3% a year for the next 100 years, we are still looking at roughly 20 billion abortions over the course of the next century. That is how dramatically large and horrifying the numbers already are. If Bitcoin were responsible for a third of the reason for this cultural shift, that would be approximately 7 billion fewer abortions as a result of Bitcoin being a contributing factor in a society that continues to value children more, and a society that values sexual degeneracy and hookup culture and everything in that sort less, right? Again, this means that if Bitcoin is only responsible for a third of only reducing the number of abortions by 3% every single year over the next 100 years, that is a very, very significant number. And to make it even more personalized, if you are one of Bitcoin's, let's say, 10 million core adopters, if you're one of the first 10 million people adopting the Bitcoin network, which potentially could be responsible for a third of the reason why we are reducing the number of abortions in any given year by 3%, then it is not unreasonable to say that you indirectly have helped reduce 700 abortions over the course of the coming century. Your tiny little actions today, as being one of the first 10 million adopters of Bitcoin, have a massive and tremendous second order and third order impact on your children, on your children's children, and on the global impact for the world, and having more optimism. And I think it's entirely reasonable to say that your actions in Bitcoin today have indirect consequences at helping people of the future be more optimistic, be less likely to be deceived by state-sanctioned violent propaganda, and are more likely to value and cherish and preserve future human life and children instead of to squander it and destroy it. Building a monetary standard that respects human life is the fastest way to align economic incentives with that belief. Right now, we live in a quadrillion-dollar monetary system that is not incentivized to respect and value proof of work, proof of time and labor being contributed to the money. And so, of course, because we live in an economic incentive structure that does not prioritize or care for human life and human beings being made in the image of God, but instead of just cogs in a machine of political currency, of course, this is the bleak future we're looking at. However, your actions, as small as they may be, very well could have a tremendous impact over the course of the coming century. I think it's entirely possible that every single Bitcoiner advancing the network today indirectly could help have dozens, if not hundreds, potentially even thousands of fewer abortions over a very long time horizon once you're factoring in second order effects. The single most cost-effective way to disincentivize abortion is by shrinking the ability for dishonest weights and measures to subsidize its expansion and normalization via a misinformation campaign funded by misinformation tokens, which are political currency units. Bitcoin is not the cure, nor is it the only remedy to this crisis. However, Bitcoin is the most asymmetric tool we have to help this cause. Obviously, the solution for all of society's ills and despair, including this issue, is individual transformed hearts. However, a collective monetary system to incentivize people to look inward at their own heart and accept responsibility is a great tool at helping assist people have transformed hearts. So I would encourage you to buy Bitcoin not only for the number go up elements, but to buy Bitcoin for the world's defenseless. This includes the world's poorest people on the global wealth ladder because they're the ones being stolen from to enrich those close to the money printer. However, it is also just as equally true for the world's defenseless children that are being exterminated, that are being eliminated from the future world purely because so many people, in particular young people, have despair and hopelessness and selfishness when it comes to evaluating the future and their future prospects. Give the world a monetary system that doesn't rely on zero-sum thinking with a selfish bent, and you will be surprised as you see more and more people have a more selfless attitude and don't have zero-sum mindsets. And hopefully, God willing, we will see even more positive impacts on the world as we have a monetary system that respects human life transform the entire planet.